Right now, I think it's quite important for my non-academic philosopher listeners to get a good handle on just what it means for something to be labeled an ontological argument, in case they haven't even heard of the word ontology before. So what is an ontological argument for the existence of God or gods?
So probably it's easiest to do this by way of contrast with other kinds of arguments. So there are some arguments for the existence of God that start with a question like, why is there something rather than nothing? Or, where did everything come from? Or why are there such complicated things as human eyes and human brains and so on? So we're thinking that there's some data, some facts about the world that we live in that require explanation, and the kind of argument for the existence of God suggests that the best explanation for having this data, for there being these features of the world, is that God exists and God made the world so that it would have those features. Right, so that gives you, and we can extend this so to other realms. So you might think there are moral truths, and you might think that the best explanation for why we have some moral truths is that God exists and God decreed that these things be true, and so on. By contrast, ontological arguments don't appeal to any data. At least that's the kind of standard line. Rather, we just start with something like a definition or an idea or a concept of God, and we argue that there must be something that answers to that definition or idea or concept or whatever, without appealing to any further data. Somehow or other, we can just, by logic alone, we can reason to the conclusion that God exists from no assumptions whatsoever, just apart from making some assumption about what the nature of God is. So that's roughly what ontological arguments are.
Now, I would have thought, though, that ontological arguments gained that moniker because of the operating word ontological. It just had to do something with the existence of God, since ontology is the branch of metaphysics concerned with existence. But it sounds like a different name might have more accurately described what this sort of argument entails.
So,
do you happen to?
So Kant referred to it as the a priori argument, and that fits much more closely.
That makes more sense.
Yeah. So lots of the traditional arguments have bad labels. So people often talk about arguments from design, but they're not from design, they're for design, right? And what remains to be established is that there's stuff in the world that really is a product of design. And similarly, ontological arguments, the label's not great.
Okay. Well, that's important then, because I was going to ask how much an ontological argument depended on, or how much they do in general depend on a definition of existence, because this in itself is a hugely thorny issue in metaphysics, far beyond God. So, I mean, do numbers exist? Does love exist? Do properties, Sherlock Holmes, these sort of things? But it sounds like, since existence isn't the front and center consideration here, maybe it doesn't totally hinge on the question of existence.
So, yes and no. There's a small number of kind of subsidiary topics that come up when you start talking about ontological arguments. I mean, it depends which ontological arguments you're talking about. But yes, exactly. Meinong is a topic that is inevitably going to come up. Not inevitably, it doesn't really come up when you're talking about the Gödel argument, but it certainly comes up when you're talking about Anselm's argument and arguments related to Anselm. And I think it also comes up when you're talking about Cartesian arguments as well. And so in that way, metaphysics of existence turns out to be central, because we have to make some decisions about whether we're going to distinguish between existence and being, and if we are, what, or existence in the understanding and existence in reality. And then we're going to have to work out, and what's the theory that governs this?
Got it. Okay, yeah, well that's very good to know. I found it incredibly helpful to start a lot of discussions on the podcast, especially when they concern these big questions we've been grappling with for a very long time with historical context. So I did an episode on the history of modern ethics, and I went through medieval or modern political theory, and maybe it would be a good idea for us to start, as you do in your book, with some of the more historical ontological arguments. And I take it that Saint Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century was the first to give a fully laid out argument of this sort. And did you say that it was in the uh, Prosologian, or how is it
Proslogion. I
pronounced?
don't know how to pronounce anything from
Okay.
Latin, so I may be getting it
Okay.
wrong. So, and in
Okay.
any case, there are differences across the ditch. We have different pronunciations anyway.
Okay.
Um, so there may be, and people argue about whether there are anticipations or other formulations of ontological arguments in Islamic traditions or Greek traditions going back long before Anselm. But in the West, at least, the first ontological argument, I guess, is Anselm's. And it draws on a kind of formula, a way of describing God that is in Augustine and maybe in earlier sources as well. God's that than which no greater can be conceived. So that's the kind of way that God's being understood.
Mm-hmm.
Or in fact, the way that the kind of the proslogion works is Anselm starts out by saying, we believe that you are that than which no greater can be conceived, proves that, in his mind, proves that there is such a thing as that than which no greater can be conceived, and then goes on to show that that than which no greater can be conceived has a whole range of traditional divine attributes, and on that basis it's reasonable to suppose that that than which no greater can be conceived is God. So it doesn't start out with a definition, it just starts out with this formula.
Mm-hmm.
And what proslogion 2, the kind of interesting part for most of us, aims to do is just to show that there is that than which no greater can be conceived. And
And okay,
yeah, go.
maybe since there's a lot to cover, we don't need to take that second step of connecting it to the divine attributes. But I am curious about how he goes from this concept. Let's see if I can get it right. That than which no greater of which can be conceived. He goes from this concept to the existence of something to satisfy this
Yeah,
concept.
yeah, that's
How
right.
does he make this move?
Okay, so he starts off in the background. He's got this distinction between things that exist in reality and things that exist only in the understanding. Right now,
Okay.
I want to connect that to ultimately to kind of Meinong, and there's the distinction between being and existence. But for now, let's completely park that and just go with Anselm. So Anselm says whatever is understood exists in the understanding. When I say that than which no greater can be conceived, you understand it. So that than which no greater can be conceived exists in the understanding. That's the first part of the argument, a part that often gets ignored, but it's important because it shows you that the theoretical framework is doing some work. And it's kind of odd, right? Because we don't have an explanation of what it is to exist in the understanding. We don't have an understanding of what it is for something to be. We don't have an explanation of what it is for something to be conceived in the text. But you might already wonder, okay, so when I hear some words and I understand them, right, what constraints are there on my understanding certain sets of words? If I say the round square, do I understand it or not? Right. And this is
Mm-hmm.
clearly relevant because when I say that than which no greater can be conceived, you might have worries of the same kind that you might have if you hear the words the round square. You might think that there just couldn't be anything that answers to that.
Yeah.
Okay, but that's criticism. That's not exposition of the argument. So what we've got is, at this point, according to Anselm, that than which no greater can be conceived exists in the understanding. And what he's going to argue is it can't just exist in the understanding, but then the only other option is that it must also exist in reality. Right? So there's going to be a kind of reductio on the idea that it exists only in the understanding. It's going to go something like this. Given that I can conceive of this thing, that than which no greater can be conceived, existing in the understanding, I can conceive of it existing in reality as well. But it would be greater if it existed in reality than if it existed only in the understanding, right? So there's a contradiction in supposing that it exists only in the understanding, so it must exist in reality as well. So there is that than which no greater can be conceived. Now, I've said it quickly, and you probably suspect that that was kind of slippery, and you might be really wondering how you could formalize it. And I think that those are going to be good questions, but that's the argument.
Okay. And no, you did formulate it quickly, but I followed it, and I'm wondering I'm sure there are a few flaws in it, but is there a critical flaw that you can point to right off the bat that precludes it from being convincing for you?
I think it's very hard to point to the flaw in it.
Okay.
So what I think is tricky is what's the theory? What's the background theory about existence in the understanding, existence in reality, and conceiving, and how these things connect together? When you write out the argument and you write it out as a set of premises, you look at the conclusion, it's just not obvious whether or not the conclusion follows from the premises. These are very complicated linguistic expressions and not easily translated into a familiar logic, like try to translate them into predicate calculus, for example. It's not. It's just really hard to do it. So it's not clear. What I think you need to do is you need to think about what the principles governing existence in the understanding, existence in reality, and conceiving might be, in order for it to turn out that the argument turns out to be valid, right?
Okay.
But Anselm doesn't, at least not in the proslogion, he gives you none of that background. And so straight off, if you're trying to do the kind of standard analytic philosopher thing on this text, it's hard to do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have the sense that untangling all of this would take a very, very long time. And so my inclination is to move on to the Cartesian arguments that you mentioned earlier. And I know that Leibniz was a defender of Descartes and might have made some additions here. But do you think it's worth saying something more first about Anselm? Wasn't there also the Proslogion 2 where there might have been another argument?
So Proslogion 3 has a different argument, but that's an argument really that than which no greater can be conceived can't be conceived not to exist. Right? There's a kind of contradiction there. So that's not an additional argument for the existence of that than which no greater can be conceived. It's just establishing one of its properties. And we kind of agreed we'd bracket that. There is another thing to say, though, which is that Anselm had a critic who published the year after he wrote the argument, a fellow monk called Gaunilo. And Gaunilo claimed...
Gaunilo?
Yeah, Gaunilo, Gaunilo.
Nice.
So Gaunilo argued that you could take Anselm's argument and just copy it, but apply it to a different subject matter and get out absurd results. So consider that island than which no greater island can be conceived, right? surely you understand those words. So it exists in the understanding, but it can't be that it just exists only in the understanding, because we can conceive of it existing in reality and that would make it greater. So it follows that there is in reality an island in which no greater island can be conceived. But hang on, that's crazy, right? We know there's no such thing. So there's got to be something wrong with Anselm's argument. And this is now where those questions about the background theory become really important. Right. So,
And
okay. So that's the,
oh yeah, and I just wanted to flag that this goes right back to the first half of our discussion and what makes for a good argument. And this seems like a good argument. He's taken the sort of premises or the framework of Anselm and shown that something absurd
yeah,
for Anselm can be produced from it.
yeah, indeed. Right. And Anselm really didn't have a good, in my opinion, Anselm really didn't have a good response to Gornillo. I mean, Gornillo didn't nail the objection. The way that he presented it wasn't quite as clean as the way I just gave it, but his example was a perfect island. And it was clear I think it's quite clear what he was getting at.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, what then, moving on, were or was Descartes' ontological argument?
Okay, so this is even trickier. Talking about this is even trickier, I think, um,
Okay.
than talking about Anselm. So there's a kind of a really dinky little argument that you can see written out in various places by Descartes that goes like this: by definition, God is that which has all perfections. Existence is a perfection, so God exists. Right? That's now Descartes didn't like syllogisms. Apparently, he didn't really like logical arguments, and he didn't really um, want to commit himself to saying that that was a proof of the existence of God, because it just sounds straight off the bat, even if you're a theist, you're going to think it can't be that easy, right? Right? God has all the perfections, existence is a perfection, so God exists and we're done. Seriously? Right? And part of the reason is, let's just take a leaf from Gornillo and pick a different subject matter. So consider Rod, the tallest existent Martian, right? By definition, right? Rod's the tallest existent Martian. Since he's the tallest existent Martian, he exists, so Rod exists. That looks pretty bad, right? And
Yeah.
the way that Descartes scholars now talk about Descartes, the ones interested in philosophy of religion, somehow or other, they seem to think that there's this intuition, right, that Descartes was appealing to, where he thought that it was clear that we had this idea of a being that has all perfections, and it was clear that it was in good standing, and so because we had these intuitions, it was safe for us to infer that it exists. Whereas we don't have the corresponding intuitions when it comes to Rod, the tallest existent Martian, and because we don't have these intuitions, somehow or other that idea is kind of that the kind of idea of the tallest existent Martian is somehow confected or hokey or something. The argument doesn't go through. But even if you say it like that, that just strikes me as completely unconvincing, right? If you're not a theist, you're going to think these things are in the same camp, right? The God and the tallest existent Martian, sorry, the being that has all perfections and the tallest existent Martian, are just in the same camp, right? If the argument worked in one
Mm-hmm.
case, it would work in the other case. And I think that that's a pretty standard view about the Cartesian argument these days.
Okay. And where did Leibniz then come into this?
So Leibniz thought that that really what Descartes was arguing was something a bit different. That Descartes was assuming that it was at least possible that God exists, and that was so. It's at least possible that there is a being that has all of the perfections, and from that, together with some other assumptions, you can pretty quickly get out the conclusion that God exists. But Leibniz thought that that premise required defense. And so he
Okay.
had an argument that it's possible that there is something that has all of the perfections. And his argument on behalf of that, lots of people don't find very compelling. It's something roughly like this. He thought of perfections as kind of simple, positive properties. And because they were simple and positive, they couldn't be in contradiction with one another. And so there had to be something that was the sum of all of them. Sorry, it had to be possible for there to be something that was the sum of all of them. There was no contradiction in the notion of the sum of all perfections. And because there was no contradiction, we could infer a possibility. Now, that last step you should worry about, I think, because sort of logical possibility is one thing, and you might think that metaphysical possibility is another. Metaphysical or ontological possibility is another,
Mm-hmm.
and we didn't bridge that gap, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
hard to see how Leibniz's little argument there about the compossibility of the kind of simple positive properties is going to bridge that gap because it's a merely logical compossibility.
Now, in the book, you divide ontological arguments into 6 classes. There's the definitional, the conceptual, the Hegelian, the Meinongian, uh, the modal, and then the experiential. Is this a precursor or just one of what you've classified as a modal argument?
So the lots of arguments fall into more than one category. So yes,
I see.
I think that
Yeah.
Leibniz at this point is inventing the modal ontological argument. This is the an argument that goes something like this: if God exists, how do I want to do this? It's possible. One premise is going to be it's possible that God exists, and the other one is going to be necessarily if God exists, then it's necessary that God exists. So the idea is that God's not a contingent being. Either God exists of necessity or it's impossible that God exists. But if it's possible that God exists, that rules out one horn. What's left is it's necessary that God exists. And if it's necessary that God exists, then God exists. So that's a modal argument. It's clear that Leibniz has that. But Gödel borrowed from Leibniz, and the talk about positive properties and the sum of all positive properties suggests a kind of higher order formulation. If you think in terms of predicate calculus, it's not first order predicate calculus, it's going to be higher order. And that's characteristic of Gödel's argument. So from Leibniz, the modal argument, and there's a modal dimension to Gödel's argument too, right? So there's simple modal arguments, and then there are more complicated ones in higher order modal logic, and that's where the Gödel argument sits. I hope that was
Hmm.
clear.
And yeah, it was. And so I mentioned Joe already, but I've seen that on his channel there are lots of videos on modal arguments. And this is something that you and I haven't broached yet. But I'm wondering whether modal arguments are currently in vogue, because from where I sit as a sort of contented atheist, I don't ever really think about contemporary philosophy of religion or the fact that there are contemporary theologians still very much working on this topic and demonstrating God's existence. Is this a current tactic that is being used that you're seeing new versions of?
Okay, so our new entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia has a very large, well, if it gets through in its current form, has a very large appendix, a subsidiary section on on what are called symmetry breakers for the premise in the modal ontological argument that says that it's possible that God exists. And in the last decade or so, there's been a huge number of articles in which theists have argued in one way or another that we should prefer the premise that it's possible that God exists to the premise that it's possible that God does not exist. Because if you go back to the original argument, if we suppose rather than it's possible that God exists, we suppose it's possible that God doesn't exist, and either God exists of necessity or it's impossible that God exists, the conclusion is it's impossible that God exists, and so God doesn't exist, right? So we've got these two arguments that look symmetrical, right? Why should we prefer one of them to the other, right? So we need some reason. And so there's a very big literature, which is Joe has in particular has studied this literature a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So there are
It,
various ways that you might try and break that symmetry, but I think you're quite justified to think that from your point of view, it's possible that God doesn't exist looks at least as attractive as it's possible that God exists. So there's no way
mm-hmm.
that one of these arguments is. It's no way that the other argument, the one you don't like, is going to succeed.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the arguments or the types of arguments in particular that I was curious about is the Hegelian argument, because you said in your introduction to the topic that you weren't confident that what you present is actually Hegel's view. And I was wondering if that was because, like me and many other analytic philosophers, you have just a lot of trouble reading Hegel.
So yes, and I know people who are experts who've read sort of a lot of what Hegel wrote, and it's I feel uncomfortable talking about Hegel's philosophy when I just haven't read enough of it. So he lectured on several occasions. He gave a series of lectures under the title "The Ontological Argument," and I've read those. Not with a great deal of understanding, but I've read them. And I found it very hard to get a sense of what he thought the premises of the ontological argument are. That is, when he was talking about the ontological argument, there's a definite description there. There must be an argument with a set of premises and a conclusion that he's got in mind. That's what I thought, and I couldn't find it. Since I wrote the book, and since the last time that the entry was updated, I've read some more stuff on Hegel and the Hegelian argument. In particular, there's a couple of people at the University of Sydney, Diego Bubio and golly, I've forgotten his name. He's a friend of mine. Anyway, and they argue that sort of that there's an argument that Hegel's got in mind, but they still won't say what the premises are and what the conclusion is. And so in the latest version, there's some discussion about all of this, and in particular, a kind of some critical discussion of some recent work in which people have tried to argue that Hegel himself is a defender of an ontological argument. But the way that things stand at the moment, I still think it's the case that the people who talk that way aren't thinking that there's an argument, a set of premises, and a conclusion that Hegel's committing himself to, where it's clear that that thing's an ontological argument. They've got something rather different in mind, which is kind of hard to pin down, which is that somehow or other out of Hegel's philosophy, there emerges a commitment to, well, it's not clear that it's the existence of God, because that depends on some questions about the overall interpretation of Hegel's philosophy, whether you interpret him as an idealist or a kind of metaphysical realist of some kind, or a kind of whatever. So I don't think that what I said in the book or in earlier versions of the Stanford Encyclopedia entry was really satisfactory. I think we do a bit better, but we probably still need. I think this will be an ongoing topic.
Hmm. Well, the last of the ontological arguments that I'm particularly curious about is Gödel's, but it's also possible, since I mean he was a formal logician, that it might be too complicated to get into over audio in this format. Is that how you
So
feel about it?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Though I mean, it's true that the Gödel actually messed up his proof so that it required some amendments in order
Oh,
for
really?
yeah. And so there were uh, so he kept returning to this. So it was something that he was keen on. He was very interested in Leibniz's philosophy, and he had there's several places in his notebooks where he sketched out or wrote out an argument, um, which he thought of and which he said was a kind of a formal presentation of Leibniz's work, which is probably underestimating the originality of Gödel's contribution, but was kind of typical of him. The proof started to circulate in the 70s, so he wrote it in the 30s or the 40s, but never published it. And I don't think he showed it to very many people either, so not many people knew about it, but it was in the notebooks. And after he died, people wanted to publish everything out of his notebooks, and so this proof was published, and it was, I mean, Gödel's version of it was quite complicated, but in the last 20 years or so, people have found much more simple presentations of the proof. And so what lies at the core of the proof is the notion of a positive property. And we need a couple of axioms to govern positive properties. And the axioms that we need, first of all, if F is a positive property, then the negation is not a positive property. And the second thing we need is that any property that's entailed by a bunch of positive properties is itself positive. Now, in a kind of higher order modal logic, if you've got those two claims, it's not too hard to see that pick any conjunction of positive properties, and it's possible that that's instantiated, right? And that's the core of the proof, right? So you have these two claims that characterize positive properties, and you infer the possibility of instantiation. Now, we haven't said what the positive properties are, and the people will
Hmm.
say things like, well, necessity is positive and omnipotence is positive. And so it turns out that it's possible that there's a necessary and omnipotent being, and so on, right? So you can see how you could use this once you've got that far to allegedly prove all kinds of things. The thing to note is that if you make further assumptions, for example, that omnipotence is positive, in effect, you're taking for granted that it's possible that there's something that's omnipotent, right? Because otherwise it's not going to satisfy the first two conditions. So if you add in a bunch of things, necessity is positive, omnipotence positive, omniscience positive, perfect goodness is positive, and you conclude that there's necessarily, and let's make their necessitations positive as well. So necessary omniscience is positive. You'll get out that it's possible that there's a necessarily existent, necessarily omnipotent, etc. being, and then by the modal ontological arguments is a short step, so there actually is such a thing. Right? But the person who denies that there's a necessarily omnipotent blah, 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 thinks it's impossible that there's such a thing. He thinks it's impossible that some of these properties are instantiated. So, for example, I don't think that anything is necessarily omnipotent. So I think it's impossible. So I don't think that that's a positive property, given that positive property is going to satisfy those two axioms. So that's an explanation of both the Gödel proof and what I think is clearly wrong with it.